Okay, so I think there's still a good section of the internet that are reticent to experiment with the digital stuff. The digital modeling side of things, I still know of people in kind of big YouTube jobs that say they hate digital modeling, that they'd never use it. So I wanted to do a little video, I think, about reasons why I think this stuff is great. This is not to say that, for me, tube amps, I think, will always have a place in my room at least. If I can, on many gigs, I would often favour a tube amp, but the practical realities of life mean that sometimes the digital modelling thing is the thing to use live, and I'll just talk you through why I think that is. So yesterday's rig basically fitted into this, and this is, for me, what is so convenient about modelling. So I was gigging with the HX Stomp, as you know I love, and you know, this is on the floor. You take your leads with you, and I've got a volume pedal, you know, one preset, 3 snapshots, and a delay on the volume pedal. It gets me through the entire gig. I won't say it's as fun as a tube amp, and maybe it doesn't, for me, it doesn't feel like exactly the same experience, but I had a full PA in the car because I was on sound, and all of the other gear and monitors and stuff, and a wife actually, because she was singing. So there was just no space for a tube amp, as I had planned to use the 2-Rock on this particular gig. So, you know, I had to make do with this, and I actually really had a fun gig. And I made sure I set the channel flat and stuff, and yeah, it was really good fun. So size, for me, that's kind of the #1 top of the list reason that I think the digital modeling stuff has a great reason to exist, particularly, you know, if you've got a fly rig or something. So I went to Israel for a month for a gig, like in a dodgy hotel, like about 7 years ago, and at the time I used a Yamaha DG Stomp. If there was this around then, I would have totally used this, and that would have been really cool too, and would have been easier to get through customs and stuff. Yeah, I think size, fly rigs, portability, and then also, you know, if you're traveling and you've got time to kill and stuff, you use this as an interface. You could record with this. You know, for me, this kind of thing is just hugely invaluable for all kinds of reasons. Now, Jake yesterday actually used an HX Stomp as well, because his load-in looked like this. And I think for back saving, you know, the modelling stuff can be really useful. Now, I think there's also the kind of downside that if you do really want on stage for things to sound big and like a tube amp, you're going to have to also probably spring out for something like a power cab, or something like a Laney LFR, or something like even more expensive stuff. By that time, I think you do sort of diminish some of the advantages of it being like a smaller rig. So for me, if I have to take a massive FR speaker or whatever along with me to get a sound that feels like an amp live, then I may as well just be using a real amp, because I've kind of got rid of what I think are most of the key advantages of the modelling device. But one really cool thing about the modelling stuff is that you don't have to worry then about things like load boxes. You don't have to worry about mics and all that, because you've got your solution, it's direct. So one of the things, you know, I did a video earlier in the week about putting an IR in the loop of the 2-Rock to get that sound out the front of the house. That's kind of, if you decide that you're gonna stick with tube amps, then probably you've already got the solution in mind, but you know, you have to think about, right, am I gonna use a load box, or am I gonna use an SM57 or something like this? You know, what if you had to do a silent gig? How are you going to do that with a tube amp? Not a silent gig, but you know what I mean, where they ask you to kind of have no stage volume, basically. Have you got a way around that? You know, there's all these kind of considerations which kind of go out of the window when you've got a modelling device, because it's just made to go direct anyway. So sound men tend to kind of like it, because it does make their job to some extent fairly easy. Another downside though, and I don't know if your experience is the same, if you've been to gigs where they're using modelers, so I saw Sleep Token and they were using, I think, Kemper or Quad Cortex or something, but because of the way that sound men, I think, tend to work, and because of the way that sound travels and stuff, If it's all coming out through that same PA, I think the things that soundmen are going to focus on are going to be mainly drums and vocals. Bass kind of comes along for the ride with the subs and stuff, but I feel like guitar just gets lost quite easily in this kind of environment, whereas typically I think in the gigs of old you'd have had loads of stage volume from the amps themselves, and I think there's pros and cons to that. Of course, noisy stages are not a thing that loads of people like, but I think in terms of the experience for the musician, that can be a really positive thing. In terms of the experience for the crowd, you know, actually hearing the guitars properly no matter where you are in the audience, I think that could be a good thing. Although, you know, maybe the balance is better with a lower stage volume. I don't know, let me know your experience on that, but my experience going to some gigs is that when they're using just direct to desk modelling stuff, it gets a little bit lost sometimes. I guess the other thing is, to some extent, you're sort of stepping down from the loudness war. So you start to not have this thing where you're having to turn up things louder and louder and louder to get people with their optimal, you know, ability to listen to stuff. So for instance, yesterday Lenny was actually asking to have more guitar in the monitors and more keys, which is kind of not necessarily the norm for singers. Oftentimes you'll be hearing singers saying, can I have more of me in the monitors, I can't hear me. So that's kind of one of the sort of benefits of not having a loud amp on stage. At the same time, if only the bass is the thing that's on stage, it can be a bit more difficult for a vocalist to pitch from a bass instrument, in my experience. So if the bassist is still using a real bass amp, you can have this sort of unbalanced, in some ways, stage. It's definitely not as easy to change things on the fly than if you had a tube amp and some pedals, but there are some definite benefits. And also for the old back, I think that's one of the key things, especially if you've got a load in like Jake's. The other really cool thing about the kind of digital modelling route, I find, is that you can experiment with stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in the real world. So like cab high cuts and EQs wherever you like in the chain. You can mix together some sounds which are more to what you're wanting. You know, like my lead tone that I think of as my tone now has, you know, a high cut down to like 3.9, it's got a high cut anyway down to like 4 kilohertz, yeah, 3.9 kilohertz, and you know, a really kind of smooth roll off and stuff. These kind of things aren't possible with every amp in the world, so you can put together these kind of chains of things that may or may not be possible in the real world and experiment with them in a way that isn't really that possible in the real world, because you need, you know, either incredible volume, or you might need different pedals, you might need an EQ that goes in your effects loop. It's just, you know, this stuff is very flexible in a lot of ways that tube amps and pedals aren't as much. If you need a backup, I've got a backup, and you know, it doesn't take up much room. A backup for a tube amp, I guess a lot of people might use something like a crate power block or a quilter or something like that, or the little EHX pedals. But I think tube amps do sometimes go wrong, and it's kind of difficult to prepare a backup for that in a way that modelling kind of isn't as much, because you can just save your preset and then match that over to something else. Whereas I guess if your Fender Twin goes down and you're in the middle of deepest, darkest Cornwall, then you've got to source another amp from somewhere. There are probably ways around it. So those are some of the best things that I think there are about modelling. I guess also things like MIDI capabilities might be useful. But for me, the main factor is kind of the size and convenience, which you probably already knew. So that's not really sharing too much with you, is it? But I think it's just a decent thing. Also, I guess, actually, multiple outputs. So you can kind of be flexible with this. So I used the headphone output yesterday to go into a monitor. It's just useful in that way that a tube amp generally is not going to be either. You can do things with the modeler that you can't with a traditional setup. But I do think it is less fun, and probably I'm going to be taking out a tube amp a bit more, I think, just because I want to enjoy a gig as much as possible when I'm doing them. And I do think like a big guitar sound is more possible whatever room you're in with a real tube amp, kind of reinforcing things from a stage, especially in a situation like I'm in where the PA is also carrying keys, it's also carrying my wife's vocal and guitar. and you know, in some venues the guitar is going to get a little bit lost in that kind of sound mush, probably. Let me know if you've gone to the dark side. Did you keep your tube amps? What do you like best about this modelling stuff? I guess also it's nice for me to be able to experiment with amps that I might not ever really see in the real world, and certainly in an environment where you can kind of crank them and stuff. The chances of being able to crank a plexi in real life anymore, that seems to be a little bit long gone for me personally. Catch you in another video soon, and I'm going to now put together a preset where I'm putting the HX Stomp in the loop of the HX Stomp, because why not? Cheers.